Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be taking a look at a data-heavy UI. So whether you're designing an internal application to review metrics or a product dashboard, data can be very complex and difficult to present in a very useful way. So for this example, we'll be taking a look at a dashboard for a fictional invoicing application. Now before we begin making some changes, let's break this UI down a bit to see what we're working with. So at the top here, we have some overview data. Basically all the information that we want the user to be able to take in at a quick glance. The second section is for all the latest invoice activity, showing the 3 most recent updated transactions. And then finally, at the bottom, we have a table with more invoices displayed chronologically of when they were issued. Essentially the same data as the section above it, presented in a more condensed way. So let's kick things off by taking a look at the overview section. Now we really want this section, particularly the values, to stand out because, as I previously mentioned, we want the user to be able to take this information in at a quick glance. But at the moment, the values don't stand out that much on the page. There's really nothing drawing our eyes to them. There's much more emphasis given to the elements like the header and the buttons because they have a dark blue background. So what if we reverse that, making the header background white and consolidating the overview section and giving it a full width dark blue background, and then of course inverting all of the text. This gives the overview section a much more dominant role, helping it get the attention it deserves. We can even go as far as applying a very subtle horizontal gradient, just to give it a glow to help it pop off the page that much more. Let's also reduce the space between these elements so the overview section feels more or less like an extension of the header. This gives us a much cleaner top section. Now, these changes help the overview section stand out much more as a whole, but there's still a few hierarchical issues with the way the individual data entries are presented. First, when working with information like this, structure things to emphasize the information so it's easy to take in at a glance. The label here is important, but it shouldn't be competing with the value. So experiment with size, contrast, weight, and capitalization to provide clarity where it's needed. So in this particular example, I decided to give the label a small uppercase treatment, and I also softened the text color a bit to make the values really pop. Now, when working on a colored background like we have here, try to avoid the common mistake of simply making the secondary text gray to create the effect of reduced contrast. Although this approach does the job of de-emphasizing the text, gray text on a colored background always looks a bit off, giving it a bit of a muddy appearance. Instead, try handpicking a new color that's based on the background color. So the best way to do this is by using the background color as a starting point and increasing the lightness and adjusting the saturation until it looks right to you. If you're having a hard time getting the desired amount of contrast and maintaining an accessible contrast ratio, you can even take this a step further by rotating the hue to the nearest brighter color, so in this case, cyan. And this is a great way to keep text looking readable, but still colorful. Okay, even though we put more emphasis on the values, they still get overpowered by these big, bold buttons. And although these buttons are useful, they're more of a secondary action, and we don't want the data competing with them for attention. We could of course just make them text links, but because we're on a colored background, it's going to be a bit difficult to give them a style that's distinguishable as a click target. So alternatively, we could give them a more subtle button treatment. Something smaller and dark against the background just to bring more attention to the button text. Now the background is already dark to begin with, and it even has a subtle gradient applied to it. So we can't just handpick a color based on the background hue like we did with the label because buttons take up a larger surface area than text. By simply choosing a solid color, the buttons will have a different amount of contrast against the background depending on where it sits on the gradient. So instead, we're going to make the buttons black and reduce the opacity so the background shows through a bit. But let's not stop there. Let's get more creative with these buttons. So right now, they're taking a common approach of simply rounding the corners to give them a conventional clickable look. Let's take this a step further by fully rounding the corners to give them a softer look. We can even go as far as adding an icon like this chevron to make them even more identifiable as a click target. Containing the icon in a smaller circle that follows the button's rounded edge adds a nice subtle touch, giving this button an interesting look that prevents it from getting too lost on the page. And now that we've adopted these full rounded corner buttons, let's try to be consistent by giving our primary page action the same treatment. Okay, let's move on to the recent invoices section. So here we have a card layout to put emphasis on the 3 most recent invoice transactions. And at the moment, it's using a commonly used component to organize the data schema. Now remember that your UI, it doesn't need to map one-to-one with your datas and fields. You don't need a label for every piece of information. In a lot of situations similar to the data we're looking at here, you can tell what something is by simply knowing the context and looking at the format. In this case, it's quite clear we're looking at a client's name, being that we're looking at a name in the recent invoices section of this invoicing application. And by including the currency in front of this value, it becomes quite clear that we're looking at the amount of this invoice. Now, in some cases, it might even be helpful to change the way the information is displayed entirely. Take this date, for example. It might be more useful to display the date so the user doesn't have to do the math in their head to understand how soon it is. We also need to remember that not all information should be treated equally. And with that in mind, we can make an intended effort to make important values stand out. So in this case, we want to make the amount stand out because it's probably the one piece of information that the user is most concerned with. And when working with values like this status that have a level of severity associated with them, you can always use color to enrich the data to make it easier to interpret. So for example, we could use yellow for pending transactions, red for higher severity actions like overdue payments, and then green to indicate which invoices have been paid. When using bright colors like these, you'll be surprised how dark you need to get to maintain an accessible contrast ratio. This can interfere with the hierarchy, bringing attention to something that isn't necessarily the focus of the page. This problem can be resolved by flipping the contrast. So instead of using white text on a dark background, try using dark text on a softer background. This way we're able to continue using the color to indicate the severity of the status and still maintain a high contrast ratio. Finally, let's give this button a little more emphasis. Now there's no reason we can't make this entire card clickable, but we want to make it clear that it is a click target. So we're going to make the background where the button sits off-white and extend it to be the entire width of the card, so it more or less feels like an extension of the card. Okay, let's move on to the table at the bottom. So first thing we're going to do is contain the table in a panel with rounded corners so it's consistent with the other cards on the page. Styling tables can be tricky. It's often a lot of data to present in a condensed space. Fortunately, there are a few tricks to make content a little more digestible. So first, use alignment. Aligning columns makes tables much more scannable and makes the boundaries much clearer between columns. So for most content, it makes sense to left align the text, but for content like dollar values, it's wise to left align them so the decimal places are in columns. This makes it much easier to compare the numbers' magnitudes. Next thing we want to do is increase the row space. Give your text room to breathe so your rows are much more scannable. Just let the alignment do the work of keeping columns in order. Let's also take a look at the borders. While borders are a great way to distinguish two elements from each other, too many of them can make your design feel busy and cluttered. A more subtle way to create distinction with tables is to use zebra striping. Finally, we're going to de-emphasize the headings to allow the data to pop by using a combination of smaller, softer text. Okay, this table is already looking much cleaner, but there's a few other ideas we can explore. First, if columns don't need to be sortable, try consolidating secondary information for a cleaner look. And if appropriate, consider de-emphasizing it using smaller and lighter text. If the data calls for it, try enhancing it by including images. We're also going to update the dates as something users are more familiar with, and present the due dates as more human-readable phrases instead of the actual date. And again, like the card examples above this section, use color to enrich the data, making it easier to interpret. And these small changes all make a huge difference and are much more interesting than simple unstyled text. Okay, before we wrap up here, let's just give this design a few final touches. Now, going back to our tip about using fewer borders, we also have a lot of borders around these containers, making the page look busier than it needs to be. A better way to distinguish them from the background is making the background off-white. This also helps them pop off the page a bit more. And just to give them a little bit more pop, we're going to add a subtle shadow to them. Now, when adding a box shadow, instead of just using large blur and spread values to make the box shadows even more noticeable, add a vertical offset. This looks much more natural because it simulates a light source shining down from above, just like we're used to seeing in the real world. And speaking of natural, let's talk about the grays. So at the moment, this design has pure, fully desaturated grays, making it feel dull and unnaturally, especially when mixed with some of the other colors on the page. So we're going to saturate them with a bit of blue. This changes the overall temperature of the design, giving it more of a cooler feel. Finally, let's update the font choice. So at the moment, this design is using the system font stack. So in this case, San Francisco, which is Apple's system default font. San Francisco is a great font, but we want to find something that has a little more character and isn't going to change depending on the operating system that you're using. So let's head over to Google Fonts. Now, we all love Google Fonts. It's probably the best resource on the web for free fonts. But with that, there's a lot to choose from, and most of the fonts on there are poor choices for UIs. So if you're going to use Google Fonts and just want something reliable, head over to the sidebar and tweak the settings as you see here. So let's start with the classification. So serifs can be a bit distracting on application UIs, so a sans serif is usually a better choice. And sort by the most popular ones, so the best options appear at the top of the list. And I'd recommend a font with 8 weights. This will at least give you a regular, bold, a lightweight, a semi-bold, plus all of the italics. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to use all of the weights, but it's usually a good indicator of a quality font when it has all of these. And this is going to give you a decent list of safe choices. Alternatively, if you have a budget, I recommend using a service like Typekit, Fonts.com, or Heffler Fonts. These are all great services and allow you to use even more high-quality fonts at a fair monthly price. And much like Google Fonts, Typekit has a similar panel on the left where you can filter the results. So again, starting with a sans serif for the classification, and then we also have a few more choices here. So you're going to want something that's legible at small paragraph sizes. You also want a font that's neutral when it comes to weight and width. Fonts with a large X height are always easier to read on screens, and then with that, you get a much less overwhelming list of options. And in that list, we get one of my favorite fonts, Proxima Nova. It just looks great on screens. It's super legible, really versatile, and it just looks clean, so we're going to apply this to the design. Okay, so this all looks great on a large screen, but how does this translate to mobile devices? Well, because we designed the page on a 12-column grid, the easy thing to do is stack all of the major elements. Now, this might be a good starting point, but it does create an excessive amount of scrolling just to get past the header. So maybe there's a way to organize this information that is better optimized for mobile devices. Let's start with the navigation. So a common approach you can use to contain complex navigation like this on a mobile device is by using the menu button, also known as the hamburger menu. It works great on an application like this where the users are more likely to visit the mobile experience just to get an overview of things and leave the creation process to the desktop. But what about the overview section? Although this stack's a bit nicer than the navigation, it takes up quite a bit of vertical space. So maybe we can present this information in a more condensed way. Well, we don't want to rearrange the text in such a way that ruins the hierarchy that we've established, but maybe we could better utilize the horizontal space by moving the View All button to the right side and effectively reducing our vertical space. And as for the recent invoices, there's not much we need to change here as the cards adapt quite nicely to the smaller viewport. Okay, what about the table? Tables are a bit trickier on smaller devices. The easiest thing to do would be to give it horizontal scrolling. Now, when you're doing this, make sure to provide some indicator that there's more information beyond the screen, even if it's just cutting off the text a bit. However, on a page like this, intended to just give users an overview, it might be more acceptable to reduce the amount of information presented. For example, the dates associated with these invoices are important, and when given the real estate, they should certainly be considered. But data like the name, amount, and status contain much more information for the user to create a full understanding. So let me explain. The name acts as an identifier, and with that, the user can immediately recollect on their relationship with the client and the final transaction. And the amount is the value the user is probably the most concerned with, and by just providing the visual indicators for the higher severity transactions, it will alert the user to dig deeper by clicking through to take a closer look at those dates. And by reducing the amount of information presented, we're able to fit everything nicely on this small screen size. Okay, that pretty much wraps everything up, so let's just compare this design to the one we started with.